So I was asked to speak by Martin on the area of the theme of today, which is Mothering Sunday. And it's quite funny. Martin doesn't know me that well, but I'm often asked to speak on Mothering Sunday. So I wondered what was going on with that. For me, I always start from the point of view that the whole month of March is a month of celebration of women. And so when he asked me to speak, I was really struck by the need to celebrate women in all their diversity. One of the ladies there said what she most appreciated about her mother was that she's always there. And that's exactly what I was thinking about my own mother. She's always been there for every stage of my life. But I also know for my husband and many in our extended family, the loss of my mother-in-law is particularly poignant because she died last April. And she was my sort of adopted mother. And there was little to distinguish her from my real mother, my biological mother. And I was also reflecting on the fact that I was talking to one of my younger sisters who had to have an operation a couple of weeks ago, who's unmarried, in her late 30s. And there was a lot of talk by the doctors about the biological clock ticking and needing to think around that. And when I phoned her, we had a few discussions about that, as I'm her older sister, and she wanted my sort of advice, and praying for her in making difficult decisions about what should come after this operation. And I was reflecting also about other women that I've met on the pathway of life, who probably did not consider themselves to be mothers because they had not biologically had a child. But in my opinion, they are mothers. So my understanding of mothering has been stretched to its limits as I have gone deeper with God into what mothering really means. And I always link it to the love of God and how God is both our Father, but He's also our mother. In Him and in the Holy Spirit are the best qualities of motherhood that we could ever want. And for me, that's always a comfort because I meet many people who perhaps the experience of motherhood in their lives has not been a positive one. And that may be due to many issues that have taken place in the lives of the women who biologically bore them. And it's important to always realize that in this life, whatever the human experience of fatherhood or motherhood or family is, there's a greater experience that we can all have access to in Jesus Christ and in God the Father. And that always gives me much hope, much joy, because we don't have to be limited by our circumstances and the realities of our human relationships and how well they go or how badly they go. Because our God truly is a big God. He embodies what we lost when sin entered the world in the Garden of Eden. And He restores into all our lives the best of what was taken away when sin began to reside in our hearts and in our minds, and to determine many and shape many of our actions. And you know, the Bible is the most amazing, amazing book. It's an instruction manual for life. But it's amazing because I've yet to encounter anything that I have ever encountered in my life, either as a development practitioner or as a lawyer or as just a person, that is not dealt with in the Bible. And I used to wonder why God does that, but I think it's to just show us that there's nothing under heaven and earth, nothing under the sun that God does not understand, does not intimately know, and does not have control over. And that should always give us hope. There's nothing under the sun, no abuse, no hurt, no whatever that God does not understand. And because of that, we come to Him with an assurance and a confident expectation that the God we serve can do immeasurably and greater than we could ever imagine. And he can break the chains. Janet, that's why I was saying to you earlier when you were singing that, just gently in the spirit. He can break the chains. We don't have to be bound by anything. We don't have to be limited by anything. And these readings I chose might seem strange, but they really speak to some of this. So in that first one, in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, the Syrophoenician woman. I used to struggle with that reading a lot, because I'd say, God, Jesus, you're kind of brutal. You know, you're equating her and her child to puppy dogs that are to take their crumbs under the table. They don't sit at the high table. They don't sit at the table with the family. They sit under. And I used to struggle with that. But this is my truth. This is my reality that came to me when I was looking at that reading. Because I'm a woman of color. I'm a woman who's a foreigner in this country, even if I have dual citizenship. But I was not born in this country. I do not come from descendants of this country. And in my work, we talk a lot about racial justice and colonialism and decolonial, the need to decolonize our systems and structures and everything else around us. And as I read this, I was reflecting on the fact that God speaks to us in two ways. For those of you in the room who are the other, the not majority, he says through this Syrophoenician woman, you are worthy, you are acceptable, you have a place. We don't need to fight about our rights with God. We have a certain level of authority and access into the Holy of Holies. And it may seem strange that he uses the language of a pet dog. But pets, for those who have pets, have a very special place in the family, don't they? I used to find it strange, I'm just going to be honest as a black African. Yes, we had dogs in Zimbabwe, but I don't know whether I thought of our dogs at my house, even if they had nice names like Trixie, who was totally anti to that name by any shape or means. She was horrible to everybody. But her name was Trixie, from Trixie Belden. And we didn't see them as pests like you guys see them here. They didn't necessarily come in the house. They didn't necessarily, I remember when, in my first experience, when someone lost their pet and had to take a grief day, the Africans in the room were like, what? We didn't quite get that. But I had a geography teacher at school. She was a German nun who gave me and many of us a love for the environment. And we'd go into the Zambezi Valley on geography trips. And the Zambezi Valley is an amazing place where you can see elephants and hippos and rhinos and the beauty of God's world. And as you travel, you'll get to Victoria Falls and see that amazing creation that God has made, that is that waterfall, that great waterfall. And we would spend time communing with nature as part of our geography lessons. And the reason I just say that is because it taught me a love of wildlife. Not a love of wildlife that I want to pet it and have it walking around, roaming. I don't want a lion roaming around my house. But I respect their place in the ecosystem that God created. And I see their value, and I fight to defend the rights of those animals to also exist alongside us, for us to be good stewards of the resources that God has given us. And in this reading, she's not coming to Jesus with a argumentative, give me my rights type of approach. She's actually coming with the greatest thing that we all need to learn: humility. She humbles herself. You know, before God, none of us have a right to say a word. None of us. The only way we approach him is with humility, total submission and surrender. You don't have any rights before God. You don't have any rights, but you have privileged access and you have authority because God himself gives you authority. And this woman understands it. So she understands that she's not of the Jewish tradition. She understands that she's not a child of the promise. She's not of this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not her God in that sense. But she understands that this God can do something in her life for this child. And she also understands that for these demons to leave her child, only God can do it. This God. Not her God that she grew up with. This God. And she calls on Jesus on that basis. And Jesus honors that. He says, because of what you have done and said, it is done for you. We have privileged access, not because we're fighting about our rights, but because we choose, and it is a choice, to humble and to submit. And then God can act and work to do his good purposes and will in and through our lives, to touch the hearts of many and the lives of many. But it is by understanding first that you need to take out all the way the world has taught us and our understanding of how things function to get into the God way, the kingdom way. And so she gets that privileged access, and the authority is given to her to have her child healed. What an amazing mother. From another angle, it's an amazing example of motherhood at its very best. For those of us who have had the privilege of biologically bearing a child, I remember the day my child was born, it's as if through that umbilical cord, something changed. I wasn't someone who thought highly of being a mother. I wasn't concerned about being a mother. I was concerned about my professional life and my career. I was very much in that space. I sort of said kudos to those who are mothers, but it wasn't a big thing in my life. And I'd never felt that close to children. I mean, I like them, but from a distance, you know. Hi, bye, here's a gift. Nice, you can go back to your mom. But from that moment, I would even go into, when I went into the field, into countries, and we'd be going to schools and other places to visit the projects we support. If I heard a child cry, even at my house, in the next door neighbors, if I heard a child cry, it touched me somewhere deep that I'd never felt before. And I struggled with that for a while, because I was like, why am I so emotional? Why have I got now this emotional connection to children that I never had before? But I think the importance of that for me was because I'd never really understood that. And I'd never appreciated that in my mother. And my mom and I got closest in two places: when I was getting married, in planning my wedding, and when I had my first child. Because my first child, 2 days after he was born, had to go into ICU, poor. And I simply broke down and was a mess. And my mother and my mother's friends, because I was at her hospital, my mom was a nurse, and I was being cared for in that hospital. And those women who were actually part of the Mothers Union and women's groups, church groups in my area, in my suburb where I lived, all worked in this place. And they just formed a network of prayer warriors who stood in the gap, because I couldn't pray. I couldn't pray. I was just broken. I was just crying. And they did for me what I could not do for myself. And that's when I really started to understand the power of motherhood and this ability to break yourself down, to put yourself in other people's places, and to go where no one else can go. And these women showed me that. And I think with this Syrophoenician woman, I see the same. She didn't care about how she would look to everybody else. She didn't come to Jesus trying to have an argument, based on theology or history or any other thing, or fighting about the rights and wrongs of history and why God chose these people and not those people. She didn't come with any of that. She simply came with that brokenness that says, I care more about what you can do for my daughter than how I look. I care more about that. And therefore, I will humble myself to the minimum of everything that can be, because I want to see that happen. And so I've learned to appreciate the Syrophoenician woman and the example she gives for me. And for those of you in the room who often are the ones with privileged access because of your history, your nationality, your birth rights, I think what this also teaches us is, are we aware of who's around the table and who's not at the table? Are we aware? And how are we making room for all of God's people to be at the table? How are you making room for that? Do you see who's missing? Who's being judged as unworthy and unacceptable? And what are you doing to challenge that narrative and those positions? How are you changing the biases and prejudices, breaking them down? Because remember, at Jesus' death, the curtain was torn. And it must be torn in all our lives, so access can be for all. God's mercy is for everybody. And Jesus Christ was trying to make this point with the Syrophoenician woman. And we have a responsibility to extend the same mercy to others. And I wanted to just move on to Peter's mother-in-law. In Matthew 8:14-15 that was read for you. It was a very short passage. Jesus and the disciples visit Peter's home. Peter's mother-in-law is laid up, she's sick. And Jesus prays for her and she gets well. And immediately she gets up and begins to serve. And for me, that story, as short as it is, I used to wonder about that too. And it speaks a number of things, also around motherhood and just our humanity, our human limitations, our human frailties, our physical limitations, and how we understand them, manage them, navigate them, accept them. This woman, if she's anything like my mother and my aunts and my grandmother before her, bless her soul, who used to make us wake up at 6 a.m. every day to clean the house, rain nor shine. She lived with us for 15 years of her life before she died. But it was a blessing, even though we grumbled at the time, because she taught us so many things about service. And for some of us who grew up in countries where we had servants, maids, it was very easy for the maids, the servants, to be the people who do all the serving. And we, because we're the members of the household, learn not to serve. But my grandmother, I realized, because she herself in her youth, before she got married, had been a maid for a white British family that came to Zimbabwe. It was then Rhodesia. And she served them, and actually she looked after their kids until they grew up and left the country and came back to the UK. So she was brought up in a culture of service and understood service in ways that I don't think I've ever actually appreciated them. And she could clean a house like nobody else. And with my mother, who was a nurse, and all nurses in, I think, Zimbabwe, but I would hasten to say probably all parts of Africa and Asia, were taught how to make that hospital bed with the sharp corners. You know, you have to do it absolutely right. Yeah, I can see even here it was taught. So we were all taught how to do that. We had to do that as if we were nurses. You have to clean the house hygienically, wash your hands, and do that bed with the absolute sharp corners at the edge, how you fold the sheets. It had to be exact. But I think while we grumbled about it, they were teaching us some major lessons around service. And this mother-in-law of Peter's reminded me of that. But for her illness, she would have been serving. And it must have been a pretty bad illness for her to actually lie down. Because I know that in my youth, I never missed a day of school unless I was practically about to be carried off to hospital. My mother did not believe in days off from school. You didn't have a bad day, a snow day, a hot day, or just I'm feeling a little bit under the weather day. You went to school even if you're hobbling with a crutch or whatever you needed to do. You went to school. Because school was a privilege. And I understand that now. School was a privilege because some of us grew up in countries where black children initially did not have the same access to education that white people had. So for our parents, when independence came, this was important. This was the biggest single thing they could privilege their children with was access to education, because of education, then you would have opportunities to have better jobs, to have a better life. So they took it seriously because people died in those independence wars to give that freedom. And they took it seriously and said, you must go to school. And I guess, I'm sorry to say, I probably have brought up my children the same way. I think I've tried to be a bit less, but I'm not sure I've managed it at all. So this mother-in-law, she's very much in the space of she must be really, really ill to not be serving. Jesus realizes that and understands her desire to be of service. He understands that this is an integral role of motherhood, of womanhood, to serve. And he heals her. She didn't ask for it, but he just heals her. But look at her response. She immediately gets up and starts serving. So I guess the question I have for all of us is our response to a healing, to a visitation by Jesus Christ, by God, to immediately get up and serve in whatever way. She served in terms of in the house, in cooking and whatever for the visitors. But your service may be being demanded in different ways. How do we respond when God acts to give us something and blesses us in a particular way? Do we just say thank you and accept it? Or do we understand that we're blessed so that we can bless others? So what service is God expecting of you? But I also wanted to say just a word for mothers and women in general. Be careful, because I think in this reading, we're also being taught a lesson about the fact that it is also okay to stop. Because many women that I know serve to the point of practically killing themselves. We need to know when to take a breath, to stop, to take time out, so that God himself, Jesus, can re-energize us, reinvigorate us, and give us a new surge of power to be then able to serve. So never feel guilty about the need to stop and take time out. Because also there is a culture of self-blame. There was a song in the 80s, 90s, showing my age, called Superwoman, for those who liked R&B at that time. And the whole song was about, I'm not a superwoman. And I think sometimes we need to be reminded of that because, of course, there's also the other song that was also very famous, I'm Every Woman. And we need to balance the two. We're not a superwoman. We may be parts of every woman, but God is not expecting us to be 100% all the time, 24/7, 365 days of the year. We do need sometimes to take some time out. Then the last reading was from Mark 14, 3-9. And it was about the alabaster jar, the woman with the alabaster jar of perfume, very, very famous. And it's going to be something we reflect upon as we go into the Easter, the beginning of the Easter period. It's something that we always read when Jesus was in Bethany and a guest at Simon the leper's house. And the reason I chose this was, as we come in that cycle, I think the thing to remember about why women and motherhood is important and why we do the things we do is that at the heart and base of it all, it's about worship. Worship. And I say this, honestly speaking, because I think as mothers, we can begin to worship other things other than God. So we need to be careful that while God has blessed us, maybe with a husband for a time, sometimes not, with children, they do not become our gods. That if anything happens to those kids, our faith in God is gone. No other object of worship is allowed than God himself. Our families, our children, are his blessings and gifts. They are given to us for a time, and we often have to let them go. They are not ours to keep and control. They're given to us for a time in stewardship by God. Then we have to let them go. Let them go to live their lives independently of us. Let them go sometimes in death. I lost a cousin a few weeks ago in a car accident. It was really difficult because he was one of my younger cousins. As Tadio was saying, you become little mothers to all this. In our culture, we are their mothers, even if they're not from your womb. And it was really difficult. And my mom and I had a conversation because it was equally difficult for her because he was the oldest son of her brother who died 2 years ago, and he basically died in the anniversary month of his father's death. And that was the only, my mother's oldest brother. So we were talking woman to woman, and I know that she felt that death particularly hard because it was like a child that I remember the day he was born, the first place they came, because my grandmother lived with us there, my mom's mom and her brother's mom. They came to our house to show the baby. And he was welcomed and one of the closest people in our family because they were about the same age as my brother, who's 17 years younger than me. And they were also friends. So in each way, the relationships the bonds of love are tightened. And when someone goes in a car accident, unexpectedly, so young, everybody was like, why God? But God in his infinite wisdom does things we don't understand. But they always lead back to us learning to depending more and more upon him, allowing him to be the mother and father in our lives, the God of all comfort, and to show us how he loves us through the storm. Martin, you talked about that last week. Through the storm. We don't get parachuted out of the storm. He walks us through it. And that storm can be a storm of grief and pain that we're having to go through. All of it, God says, is worth it. And mustn't take away from that important aspect of it should be deepening our worship of him. So even in times of grief and pain that comes with motherhood, because it's not all about celebration and joy. All of it, God is showing us something. After all, he gave up his only son for us. Again, the season that we're going into. So he understands the pain and the loss. But he also says, I am enough in that pain and that loss. So he becomes a mother to the mother who is grieving for the loss of her son or daughter. He becomes that mother. The God of all comfort. And so this woman understands that. She has lived a life that I think was perhaps not acceptable, not considered absolutely right. She comes into this place and washes his feet. Again, lesson of humility. Again, a lesson about putting aside my pride and just being myself in my authentic self before Jesus Christ. And then she does what she can, which is to give the best of what she has. And that was this alabaster jar of perfume, expensive perfume. She gave the very best that was available to her to show that she understood that she, who had so much that was wrong in her life, that was sinful in her life, has been forgiven so much. And she understood, therefore, that the love she needed to give Jesus Christ had to be the same breadth, scale as the love he has shown her. And I hope that in our lives, even when you're going through the storms and the difficult times and challenges, you remember that and you hold on to it through the storm. But also remember in your times of joy to give him the very best of yourself. It is our acceptable worship to give God the very best of ourselves. That's our response to God's love. That's our response to God forgiving and accepting us. That's our response to God blessing us and gifting us in so many ways. That's our response to God being both our Father and our Mother in a way that we could never be able to imagine. That's our acceptable response, our very best, because that's what he's deserving of. And this woman understood that. And so as I end, I wanted just to end with Psalm 62, these verses. And Tadiwa will then sing for us Jireh, which is actually means in Hebrew provider, because God is our provider. We're hoping are we going to do the flowers? Absolutely. Okay, great. So we'll do the flowers at the same time for the women and to acknowledge the women in the church. But in Psalm 62 it says this, and I hope it speaks to all of you. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my defense and my fortress. I shall not be greatly moved. With God rests my salvation and my glory. He's my rock of unyielding strength and impenetrable hardness, and my refuge is in God. May your refuge, may your comfort, may your everything be found in God, who's both our Father and our Mother on this Mothering Sunday. Thank you.